Yeah. So lots of fun over the summer. Took a little bit of a break to relax and for me switch roles. But we've got Jason. So I used to work with Jason at the last company I was at. He led the dev team and was like my dev counterpart with me, the art team, and he's fantastic. So he's been, working in the industry over 5 years now. He's fantastic at DevOps. You can ask him pretty much any coding question out there, and he actually takes the time to like slow down and answer them, which is fantastic. And I know that one of the guys from my team, especially, just loves some of the stuff that he was doing with his team for like challenges and pushing it forward so that he could get better and learn more. So yeah, he's pretty cool. Jason, and he's going to talk to us a little bit today about, being a developer, becoming an architect, architects and devs, what we, Jason, why don't you take it away? I'll let you talk since you've
Okay,
been talking.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk today about the topic of how architects and developers can work together in a better way, a more efficient way, a more fun way, a more effective way. So I do have some slides here. Let me share my screen.
And question for you, is this, when you're thinking about this, are you thinking about more in a consulting space or in a, where you work space? Like
in any kind of, well, at the project level, I would say, and also at the organization or the enterprise level or company level. It's really, I want to concentrate today, focus more kind of on the soft skills of how to have an effective relationship between architects and developers. So I want to start out with how a lot of relationships between architects and developers can be. So in this model, we have the architect, which goes off on his own and comes up with the final design to be followed unquestionably by the developer, and basically is telling the developer, this is the way it's going to be, this is how you're going to do it. It's a one-way communication, and it doesn't leave any room for refinement or explanation, rationale to the developer. And so when the developer has this kind of relationship, they can either do two things. They can either ignore it if it doesn't make sense to them or they don't understand it, or they can follow along blindly, which both of those have their pitfalls, right? So for example, when I worked on a project or worked on a client, when named credentials were new for Salesforce, the design required, all web service callouts to use named credentials, and the developers didn't understand the reasoning for that. It wasn't explained to them, and so they just went ahead and coded the authentication credentials in the code as they always had, because that was easy and familiar to them, which was fine until later on down the road the credentials changed in production, which required a code deployment to update. So there wasn't that communication there back and forth between the two teams, the two roles to allow the developers to buy in to the solution. And so the other way in this one-way kind of model is, another example is back in the early days of the internet, before the .com crash, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I was working on I came in to help fix a shopping cart implementation where the architect had decided that the shopping cart items would be stored in a browser cookie to avoid having to persist them on the server side, which was followed unquestionably and unquestioningly, and worked fine until a large number of items were added to the shopping cart, which surpassed the 4 kilobyte cookie character limit, which then broke the shopping cart. So, you know, without having that feedback from developers, there was no way to kind of check that or refine that design. So we really want to foster communication between the two and not have those two roles siloed like that.
Question, Jason.
Yeah.
So how often is it that it's the my way or the highway architect, and then how often is it that there's, collaboration?
I would say it's better now than it was like
Yeah.
earlier in my career, like in the late 90s, early 2000s when I kind of started out. You had a lot more of a top-down kind of hierarchical company model in general, and so I think that just kind of was the inertia, like the standard way of doing things, right? Things came down from above and you just followed the directions. So it has gotten better.
One other question that goes with that, with your experience in more than just Salesforce, would you say that Salesforce is different than any other, ecosystem at all, or, it means one way or the other more so?
I would say Salesforce is better than, like, say, traditional software development, because usually there's a lot of like kind of cross pollination, and as far as like, I'm a developer, but I also have a little, I have my hand in like declarative click and configure stuff.
Yeah.
I've had to design some stuff on my own, and vice versa, where architects are usually coming from a development or declarative background, so they have knowledge of that that world, right? It's not an academic exercise, right, for them, or something they did 20 years ago, but now they're an architect and don't muddy their hands with implementation details, right?
Gotcha.
But I still think that this is a good.
There's always room for improvement. Yeah.
There's always room for improvement. Yeah, and reiteration of this.
And I'm really excited because I'm always looking for better ways to communicate, because I'm a really fast talker and I talk in my Megan like half language. So yeah, excited. Just you could keep going. I'm so sorry to keep interrupting.
No problem. Anytime anyone wants to talk or have a question, feel free to interrupt. This is not meant to be a one-way communication. This is would like this to be a collaborative, discussion. So, but anyway, so as far as communication goes, developers tend to build the simplest solution, the thing that's going to get it done the fastest, the fastest time to complete, and the simplest way to do it. Whereas architects are going to have the longer term vision in mind in general of how the whole system is going to work together, how it's going to work 5 years from now. And if there's not alignment there, this can result in sunk costs if the solutions that the developers made that don't fit the vision have to be refactored down the line. And to avoid that, developers need to understand the benefits of the long-term vision in order to buy into it and to follow it. And developers need to be able to influence the long-term vision by being able to have that two-way communication and to suggest improvements or changes as things change and shift on the ground, right?
And where does the idea of it doesn't matter who, but the requirements have to be written well for this to go well as well, like, because people are going to, if you've got somebody who's going to build it, I mean, even myself as an architect, if I don't have clear-cut requirements telling me to make something bigger or better, I'm just going to build it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, it's very, yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you don't know how that fits into the long-term plan, then yeah, you can, and if you have other different developers kind of working on their own piece of it, and there's not this vision to coordinate all their efforts, you can get, people can go off on their own direction, and then when it comes together to put them together, you've got a problem because things don't fit, or things don't talk to each other the right way, or you have performance issues or whatever.
Yeah, and when it comes to things like, integrations, I personally love to get my developers' opinion there and get their feedback as much as possible, just because it's something that they're actually building versus, doing the engineering of. They've seen so much more of the gotchas. And, the gotchas, well, they build that they fix before we see it. Yeah. I love this so far. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in the communication from an architect side, you can't, when you're communicating with developers, you can't be too detailed. Developers love to see the detail, and you need to include not just what the plan is, but why those decisions were made, right? So that the developers will buy into it, right? That's a really important point I don't want to gloss over, is that being transparent about your thought process and explaining maybe the different options you considered and why this one is the best one, it will save you heartache in the long run. So yes, go ahead.
Excuse me, this is Melissa Mueller here. So what I'm hearing is that my thought process on the explicit differentiation between requirements and user stories and making sure you have both of those is the correct path to go down, to not allow those two things to get intermingled and actually have separate documentation on user stories versus user stories and how they may relate to multiple different requirements for fields and objects and such.
I think that your requirements have to be in your user stories, because that's where they're going to go to get them. So they do cross over, but having a requirement as a user story or a user story as a requirement and not mixing them up for which one is which, I can see that. But I know they have to be together, because otherwise nobody's going to get the information they need to keep building. Sorry, Jason, you too.
Right. If I'm understanding correctly, are you talking about separating the why from the what, as far as like a user story or a Jira ticket being do XYZ, and
Correct.
then as opposed to saying, well, do XYZ because this is going to interface with this story over here, and so we need to make sure that these will work together.
So like having a clean board then, and linking what you need to link, and making sure you're writing stories properly with the I need to, so that I can.
I would almost, yeah.
That's where I was going, Megan.
Yeah.
So I'm working on a project right now, and we did discovery with the consultant team, and instead of them coming back and saying, oh, from this, we reviewed this discovery that we were on with you, and here are the user stories we see, and here's what we think we need to do. They said, tell us everything from a blank slate, and they gave us column headers. And so I started off with the fields that needed to, we have a new object, we're moving a bunch of stuff, calculations that happen on one object that cause the account trigger to fire repeatedly unnecessarily. We're taking those calculations off and we're putting them on another object. So I started off with requirements of what the fields that need to be moved and the new object that need to be created and stuff. And then another colleague came along and they were reviewing the discovery and they were adding to it, and they turned my requirement of field X needs to be recreated on object X into, I want field X to be, and I went, no, that's not a user story.
So I know that I never start requirements until I have my user stories down.
Right.
And yeah, so
Yeah.
in going into a ticket, the user story is always added before the requirements. And I also love to have the whole team work on user stories too, instead of making it like an arc silo.
Well,
Getting input from devs and such, I find to be important, as well as input from admins.
so the reason I started from the field side was because this had been a project that I had been thinking about for a long while. It wound up getting dragged in sooner than it was expected to be because of other front end work that was going to happen on the same same type of project. I don't know if that makes sense, but it got dragged in, and the
I've got a question, Melissa. How did you know that your requirements were going to cover everything if you didn't have the business case laid out to know about anything else that could be a gotcha that you hadn't thought about in design?
Okay, so there's 3 parts to this. There's the front end, there is the changes that they want to make to the program, and there is the project that I wanted to do, which was to remove all the calculations. So basically, they created a scorecard for an account record type of contractors, and all the contractors that fit into this. Every time a lead got created, a case got created, a lead got assigned and not assigned, accepted, and multiple different other things. The score got recalculated, and that caused
So I
multiple
get that.
triggers
I get that part,
included
but
in
I'm
the
more so
count.
thinking about
So
what about their day-to-day job? Like, what if there's something in their day-to-day job that would have impacted those requirements? Because you're coming at it very analytical, but what about the day-to-day of the people that are working on the data, so that you knew that you had covered your bases?
I guess what I'm saying is there are 3 different projects going on here. And the one I'm speaking of, is an extrication of the calculation fields from the account object is separate to the day-to-day, which is
but they're
like the
using the
second project.
records. Like, they're using that account and they're using that other object. So
Right.
what
And
was it
we're gonna
about
have
that
to-
that impacted, like, what about that was making sure that your design was going to, be okay for their day to day and wasn't going to cause a problem?
That's probably the second part of the project, where there's redesign on the calculations.
But you're moving it from one object to another. How did you know that that part was going to be okay for their job, like for the sales reps or the customer service reps, without having a user story laid out?
Okay, so I guess I have a user story in my head because I'm not a consultant. I work for the company.
Right.
And so for 4.5 years, I've seen where this has evolved, where it started from, and it's evolved to. And I've been involved in refactoring the original project. So I guess I already have that built into my head, and I have not had someone ask me that question because it is already obvious to me, and I haven't thought about how to verbally express that outwards. I could write up a user story, or I could express that in some way, but I'm not prepared to do that at this point in time.
Right. So I mean, for me, even when I was in-house, making sure I understood what is it that the business actually needs versus what do I need as somebody that's on the back end. That's always what drove what my requirements were, even when I had stuff that wasn't, purely functional. So it seemed to me like, I need to merge these two flows together because somebody put 2 flows on one object. even making sure that, who is it that needs it done, and do the actions that are in that flow still work, and making sure that I start with the user story. I don't know,
Yeah.
Jason, Paul, and I don't know if you guys have anything to say too.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're describing, it sounds like to me, is, you're trying to alleviate some performance issues, right, with triggers, right, that are firing unnecessarily because of the way the system is designed. So, I mean, that's an architectural issue, an architectural decision, and that's kind of goes to, if I understand you're having trouble getting traction on that, or so you need to, I mean, everything, this kind of goes to my next slide, which I'll just click on there, is that, no matter what your architectural decisions are, they have to provide business value, right? I mean, they always have to tie back to something that is creating quality software that fulfills a business need, right? And so, tying those, it's kind of like it's kind of like you have the business needs at the top. The architecture is designed in a way to satisfy those needs, the best way, and then the developers are there to implement that architecture. But all three levels, or all three roles, need to be on the same page, right? They all need to work together. And as an architect, you're kind of straddling that line between the business world, the business users, and the developers, right? And so you need to be able to, communicate effectively in both directions, right?
And really quick, Daniel, you're in house, right? Hoping to get your opinion since we've got all the consultants talking. Oh, and we got hands up. Yeah. So, and then we'll go to the hands. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this has been great discussion so far. And I just wanted to add that, when you talk about some of that technical behind the scenes work and, the value to the business, the way I try to talk about it is, we've made it an amazing investment, people, money, and otherwise, in the Salesforce platform being there and available to help our business. And so sometimes, you have to advocate for, for this sprint, for this amount of time, we need to address some of that tech debt, or we need to make the performance better. And it does serve the business, because then people have a system that's reliable and it's performant and, supporting all the other innovations that people want. It's not just about the next new user facing feature, it's a balance.
And I know in
yeah.
consulting, I write stories for, as an admin, I need. Do you do that in-house, Daniel?
That's a great, exactly, as an admin, I need, for us to address these, it could be fields, maybe we have too many fields, or, Melissa, you were talking about, the behind the scenes automation or triggers and things like that, and explaining. And so part of my role is the reason we have to carve out this time, or for release management, right? That's another big one. We have to carve out that time, and here's how that's going to add actually value to you as the business.
Aren't
I'll give you one more.
only 5 minutes in Salesforce though, Daniel? Like,
I'll give you another example. Right now, I'm working on fixing some security aspects of our new deployment, and it is taking away time to be able to deliver, some of the enhancements that are in the queue. So my role is to explain, the value of that is actually some of the pain you're all experiencing now. So we need to divert some time and getting that right. So I think it's all definitely about communication. That's what I love about this presentation.
Yeah, and what I try to keep in mind, or when needing to do those kinds of technical debt remediation, or refactoring, redesigning things, is that, some of these, the vast majority of the life of a application is spent in the maintenance phase, right? So you're trying to address things now before they become more expensive later, right? Trying to address and fix the problems early on is cheaper than fixing the problem 10 years from now when the system is on its knees because it can't handle, you know, the load or the amount of data or whatever it is. So, you know, as Salesforce implementers, you know, there's lots of legacy systems that we've replaced that we are replacing that are 20, 30 years old, right? And so that's the kind of time frame that we need to keep in mind when we want to you know, when we want to sell the need to remediate these things in the development, in the, you know, build phase, right?
So
Because
Jason,
catching them early is cheaper than catching them much later. Go ahead.
sorry, and I'm furiously writing all of this stuff down. This is giving me a bunch of great ideas, and I'm looking forward to the next slides. I'm hoping I'm not getting ahead of you, but the coolest part about this, about having a structured process for talking to devs and structuring your process for delivering, you know, goals and patterns from architect to dev and vice versa. One of the bigger challenges that I've run into lately, where this is going to dig me out of some huge holes, is the Salesforce developer career is exploding right now. And you are getting every level of dev with every level of exposure to each of the different components and clouds, and that may or may not be interviewing with 2 other companies while you're giving them requirements or instructions. So if you don't have a structured process for onboarding, translating, and transmitting, you know, what you expect done or how you expect it to work, and you know why and what decisions are being made, you miss that in the telephone game of next person with the different skill set. So I think this is a huge paste over a gap, a bridge over a gap that I've seen a couple of times with, you know, onboarding new or some leaving or different skill sets. So
And
fantastic.
it also kind of goes back to the item about seeing that long-term reason. You know, when writing those triggers the first time, you know, thinking about, you know, the impacts, the user story, the business need, who's using what, and the ripple effect, and having those stories for people before building. You know, it's going to make sure your dev is knowing why they need to build it a certain way, and you know why not to build it another way, versus just building it. Yeah. Oh, look at that. Brings us back home in a circle. I love it.
So yeah, so let me just go over this slide real quick if you haven't already been reading it. So it's just kind of reiterating that the collaborative communication is imperative for being effective at work. While architects manage the blueprint of the project, it's crucial that developers understand the reasons behind the decisions and have the opportunity to provide feedback to help improve the plan. And I mean, that's kind of goes back to what I said, is the one thing that, you know, architects and devs should have in common that we can all agree on is that we're trying to deliver quality software that serves the business, and that's what all this is ultimately for, right? Is to do that. And so some ways, these are just, you know, some general things to speak up is, as a developer, you need to raise your voice if you don't understand something or the reason why something is decided. You know, definitely, you know, ask questions about the design. Skipping ahead one slide. Skill up across roles. So this is kind of like, you know, having a group of architects and devs. And when I say devs, I also mean declarative and click and configure people, because in the Salesforce world, they're all implementers. But having a group of you know, blended roles, technical roles, to learn from each other and teach each other. And then the focus on value is like, we're all trying to build the best software we can. And so I kind of, given the time, I kind of want to skip to some of the slides at the end, which are kind of a how-to, one way of kind of
Hit the button. So
No problem. Yeah, so I'm going to skip to the kind of the how-to slides to present kind of one way to organize all this communication. All right. So let's see. Okay. And this is not all my, my idea. I cribbed some of this from this website down here, and I'll share a link to this this slide deck if in the chat here at the end of the meeting for people that want to reference it. So first of all, and this can be at a project level, this can be at a company level, enterprise level, but we need a place to collect these architecture developer ideas and issues. And this is gonna be as simple as a spreadsheet with these kind of columns: the date the issue was raised, the name of the person who raised the issue, who spoke up and said, hey, what about this? A keyword describing the context so it's easy to find. A short text description of the issue with potential links to other material that flesh it out. The name of the person that will take responsibility for the issue, initially empty, which will be assigned later, and then a status of the issue, open, progress, or done. So this way we have a rolling document of issues and ideas, and we are so these things aren't in people's heads, they're not lost in the ether.
Do you consider that your backlog? Or
not
separate?
really. This is not really at the level of individual like Jira issues.
So more project level.
This is more
like-
the project level, like
Yeah,
how are we
okay.
going to handle web service callouts? How are we
Yep.
going to handle
I have been building a form for doing this on my last project. Like what group does this decision need to go to? What's the impact of this decision? Does it block people? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Like,
Is anything needed in advance? Yeah.
how are we going to handle the amount of data? How much data are we expecting to have to handle, on a given day, or how
There are
much?
too many records
Don't
to
you
do
want to
it the
get
way we
surprised
talked
by
about.
large data volumes so that you can have to change your project on a dime? Yeah.
Right. So we need a repository of all these things, and so this is where they will live in some kind of document. And then we want to establish a community of practice to regularly review these issues and make decisions on them. Right. They're not just going to be it's not just a complaint session or whatever where nothing gets decided. So community of practice is a group of team members who are interested in software architecture and are actively practicing software development. So this is highlighted, actively practicing, because you need to be the people that are, you need to eat your own dog food, right? So you need to be affected by your decisions that you are making for the project or for your company or client. You need to have skin in the game. So this group this community of practice meets regularly, maybe every 2 weeks. Before the meeting, you choose topics from that list that's been building up, and that list, I forgot to mention, could be like just a shared Google document that everybody can just go and edit whenever they need to, right? And so you're going to choose which topics from that spreadsheet to discuss ahead of time. You time box the meeting, and each topic is time boxed as well, so that we're not wasting time, we're getting to the point. And so we discuss each topic, and at the end of the time for each topic, we make a decision, even if it might not be the ultimately correct decision. We make a decision, or we assign it to someone to, if like more research is needed or we need to talk to somebody else, but it gets assigned to a specific person to follow up on. And then we go through all topics, and then we would update the status to in progress. And then we also go through, all topics that we marked in progress last time to see if we have enough information to decide on those now. And so this has, this has the effect of you know, it makes people feel good because these issues aren't just hanging around and like you're waiting for somebody else to like figure out what to do, or should I be figuring out what to do? Like, how, you know, we're coming together as a team. We're gonna hash these out and we're gonna decide which way we're gonna go, right? And that feeling of progress is very motivating and great for I can't think of the word. It's motivating and it's positive energy, for lack of a better term, on the project. And so what do we do once we've made a decision? Well, we go ahead and implement it, but then when we make a decision, we record it in another document called an architecture decision record, or ADR. This is so when this topic comes up 6 months from now, we can go back and say, oh yeah, we talked about this and we decided to do it this way because of these reasons, right? And this prevents wasted time, right? You can, and so an ADR will consist of a number for easy reference, a title, the decision that was made, the reasons for the decision, and the goals we hope to achieve with that decision, right? So this is incredibly helpful because if you're like me, I look at code that I wrote 2 weeks ago and I can't remember what the heck I was thinking or what, you know, why I designed it or wrote it the way I wrote it. That's why I comment things extensively. This is basically commenting for architecture decisions, right? And this is very useful in, you know, when issues are brought up 6 months down the line, and, you know, instead of wasting time discussing it, we can just look back and say, oh, look, we discussed this 6 months ago. This is what we decided, what, you know, let's move on. And it saves a lot of time. And you have a record of everything that was decided and why. And, you know, if things change, we can go back and say, oh, well, the reasons for the decision we made aren't valid anymore, right? And so maybe we need to change what we decided, but at least we know, you know, why we are changing our minds, right? Because the reasons have changed, or maybe our goals have changed. So that's kind of a simple 3-step process for enabling this communication and working these decisions or working these issues. We do something like that at my current company, not just for technical issues, but things that also kind of affect the development team, architecture team in general, you know, company type issues. We meet every week and we go through the list and we, you know, hash things out and create to-dos or we make decisions. And it's a really great feeling of progress, you know, that, you know, this is a place where issues get handled, right? Things get decided. We're making progress.
When you document those, are you putting them in a RAID or are you leaving them separate?
What do you mean?
Do you have like a team RAID, like you know, what are your risks? What are your decisions? Do you have like one for higher level on projects, or just do it like item by item?
I guess you would have it. I guess it depends on kind of what like each issue would have its own document, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay. So I'm more so thinking about it. Do you have one that's like a project level to help with your prioritization and to help with your change management and deciding their projects and what goes where and, you know, where you're going to go?
Yeah, I mean, you can do this at different levels, right? You can do this at an individual project level.
Yeah.
You could do this at the team level, you know, and discuss issues regarding multiple projects. And do, you know, that's where we kind of do it at my company. We kind of do it at that level. So we might discuss, you know, or general issues like how are we going to do, we need to improve our DevOps process. Like let's explore some different avenues. You know, Jason, you take point on that and have something next week to talk about or whatever, you know. So
and are there certain areas that we should really make sure that our dev's voice is clearly heard? Like I make sure that my devs have a clear voice in, integrations, especially.
Mhm.
I know I
Yeah.
said integrations before, but I really want their opinion on that one before I come up with my design. Are there other areas that we should be keeping in mind for our devs on that kind of stuff that, we don't know what we don't know, we can be learning from them too? Or should it be across the board?
I think across the board, but one thing that's kind of unique about Salesforce is that you've got this kind of what I think is an artificial or unnecessary like division between like Apex developers and declarative folks.
Right.
Because the design, when you're thinking about, oh, how are we going to implement this story, how are we going to implement this feature, well, is it a flow or is it a trigger or is it a combination? Like just deciding what tool to use is a decision, right? And
So one specifically with flows, since you mentioned them, I know that a lot of times we'll just have, the admins or the declarative folks are building out flows. I know that just over the past year, I've definitely switched over to making sure we have that code coverage and a test class for flows.
mhm,
So pairing a declarative person up with a developer, and then also making sure, are we covering everything that we needed to? So that we can build out a test, or is there a gap in the design because we just
mhm.
weren't doing tests before? Sorry, make sure you cover your flows with tests. It drives me nuts when I go to an Oregon. It's like horrifically sitting with a coverage, but flows
Yeah.
covering those helps. Yeah,
And
I
and
like the buddy
also,
system.
yeah. Yeah, and also I've worked on projects where like the declarative people were kind of doing their own thing and the devs were doing their own thing, and then you would get these, why isn't my trigger working? Oh, there's some flow
Right.
that I didn't even know about that's like modifying this object, you know, and
And
I
I
just
had
spent
something
all day
very
trying to figure
similar.
out where the bug in my code
Yeah.
was when, there was some flow I didn't realize,
It was my
so.
first project when we were working together. The declarative folks had been doing their thing and the devs were doing their thing. Lo and behold, the quote object though had so much stuff on it. We ended up having to go fully dev. We could have caught that so much sooner if we
Mhm.
would have had some better communication.
Right.
Yeah,
With
Right.
with
and
flows
collaboration.
getting the nod, um, and process builders and workflows going out, but now that there's orchestration and flows can be triggers, I am looking for somebody to put together a how to centralize Apex triggers and flow triggers into a single kind of pattern that you can follow and use both. Like, we do trigger
Mhm.
handler frameworks so that all the triggers are launched, all the code is launched from a single trigger, and you can see where everything begins, and you can go start hunting down classes as
Mhm.
opposed to
Yep.
having to read source code, but knowing how many flows are touching the same object, or
Mhm.
how many process builders or other
And
automation
when?
types
Yeah.
and MuleSoft listeners and so forth. Um, I'm ready for somebody to put together, or I'm ready to
So
sit down and start trying to put together a best practice around that. But I
on
keep
the
watching the medium.
on the flow side, you're welcome to come to the flow training that I am doing because of a bunch of Twitter responses, and they'd offer one person to walk them through flows. Next thing you know, I've got 8 people that I'm teaching in October. So we're going to be doing a 5-part flow class in October if you want to come. Yeah. And it kind of does that to the flow level of coming up with a pattern for your org. But you've got to keep in mind, even when we had Process Builder and when we had workflows, everything wasn't coming from the same place with the same pattern. The automation had its pattern and then code had its. But making sure that we're not causing problems for each other is definitely important. And which one are you going to use on which object? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, you could definitely have a trigger handler framework that called your flows, and you would just have to
But,
work
but do
between
you want
people.
to?
Yeah,
Like,
but
yeah.
but you still, if you once you're debugging, hey, why is this object keep getting deleted? Well, you've now got a bunch of different key places to go start debugging, and that's, like I said, the trigger handler framework was supposed to bring some sanity to that. And now that flows can do it also, and how many are there? Is there one flow per
It
object,
wasn't,
one
it's
process
one,
builder per
well,
object,
no,
that kind of
because
stuff?
process builder would have been one, but you've got to have like one create and one, you've got to have one that's starting with your record edits, but you've got everything for flows where they're doing like schedules,
Yeah.
where they're off a button. So you can't have them all, just one per object.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always said, yeah, 2
Conversation
process
is
builders
scaring
per
me.
object.
This whole conversation is scaring me. As a developer, I have always said, if there is a trigger on an object, there should not be any process builder, workflow rule, or flow that does anything to the same object. It shouldn't update that same object. The only thing that it should do is send it a message, an email or whatever. And the idea that flows can do so much more, and people are starting to integrate them and think that it's okay to have the same thing. All you're instigating with thinking that that's okay is recursion. And
So
you're
well, you have the ability to
ultimately-
turn recursion off too. But it's more about
it's
making sure you have a
just
plan.
scary.
But you can't have just one or the other. It's difficult now to have one or the other, with the fact that, and you couldn't have, in my opinion, you couldn't have an object with just code and not have any workflow. It
Well,
just wouldn't work out that way.
yeah, you have up until now, when they've given us orchestrator, which is, we don't know if we've been given it yet or not, but you had to have workflow rules for approval processes, and you had to have these things.
That's
And
workflow
moving away from
action.
it's fine, but workflow rules that send email messages and approval processes don't interfere with updates that are going on in a trigger, but flows and workflow rules that do updates on the same object that the trigger is firing on cause problems. And I hate when people forget that. And that's still going to continue even with the new advances of flow.
So I still see, just because you have code on an object doesn't mean you can't have workflow rules in the past, because of the fact that Salesforce was always pushing for clicks, not code. You would have a code for something that's complex, but you would have like your, oh, we need to move this to locked now that we have a close one opportunity, or we need to update this with the finance or finance check whenever the finance person does some action. Sticking with some declarative, I find important on objects. Now, multiple process builders for objects, no.
I guess you've been lucky enough to not have a admin that was there 4 years before you that built separate workflow rules for every field update on the same object. So
well, were they
there's
all
like
triggered by the same criteria?
Well, no, it doesn't matter whether they're the same
for
criteria.
workflow rules. It
If
does,
the criteria fires at the same time, like someone goes and edits 10 fields on an account, and each of those fields has a workflow rule that updates something else, all 10 of those will fire.
But
And
that's if they make the action. Just because they're checking to see if the action happens doesn't mean they're actually firing the action. Workflow rules happen on create, on edit, and then every single time. But it's always checking for something. And if that criteria wasn't met, then it wouldn't fire all the way. That's why you would have different ones for different scenarios. Just because they happen to edit all 10 fields this time, so 10 fired, sometimes they only edit one, so only one should fire. And it was only 1, 2, or 3, 1, 2, 3 for your path forward. You didn't get to have criteria that would single out actions. Every action had to be tied to that workflow that it was going to do. That's why you would sometimes have 10 workflow rules firing, but it wouldn't workflow rules. I mean, you could have as many as, like, they give you up to 50 per for your objects. And I don't know. I still think if you have code, that doesn't mean you couldn't have a workflow rule. I'm terrified though that workflow rules and process builder are going away, and everyone's going to be in flow. That's my big fear. But yeah,
well,
just because it gives you delete.
And true to the core, they said that they were sunsetting it similar to S controls, where
So it's going to be about 10 years then. Yeah.
well, that they would eventually announce a date where we wouldn't be able to create new ones, but
Right.
your existing ones would still work. So
Correct. And I mean, it's 2021 and I still see orgs with S controls that, exist.
work.
So
Yeah.
it's not like
Yeah.
they're going to be gone. That's why I worry when everybody's like, we need to switch everything over to Flow now. It's like, wait till you have a requirement. Like, don't just go switch it to switch it. Yeah.
Yeah, and the tweet went out from that meeting really quickly that workflows will be gone in 2023. And the way he was saying it, I took that's when they were going to have a plan or start implementing a change, not that that's when the change would be done. That was,
And I totally think that's the way it's going to happen too, because that's kind of what we were saying on Twitter a couple of weeks ago when it came up. Yeah. It's going to be at least 5 years before they can block you. Yeah. Sorry about that, Jason.
No problem. I think we're at time.
So one thing that I was curious about, in addition to if anyone has questions for Jason, is how is everyone else working together for their collaboration with ARCs and devs? What are some of the things that have worked for you? What are some areas that, based on what Jason was saying, you could see some improvement? Yeah. Who's going to be brave and go for it? I don't know if you, Melissa, have any feedback. Melissa Shepherd, since you haven't talked yet.
Oh, on which topic?
So what are ways that you collaborate as an architect with your developers? Is there anything that's a win for you? And then what are some areas that you wish you collaborated more?
Yeah, so collaborate on standards. And I was just having this conversation with Neha that I always suggest Confluence as a way to have a central repository for things like documenting what you've done and why, and where people can go first to check if there's something they can already use, and also documenting standards.
I wish every org I worked in had standards. That would be a life changer. Yeah.
Define them up front.
Deborah, it's nice to see you again. Not anyone else have any feedback?
Yeah, I
Neha?
don't know if we discussed this yet, but whenever a new developer who joins the team, I think we always should have a practice of keeping some documents in a central repository, like Melissa mentioned in Confluence, to make them understand that, hey, this is the document you need to read while you're onboarding to the team, and read those standards and follow these processes, whether it's a development process or development standards or DevOps standards, or how we communicate, how we, update these documents later, right?
yeah, I totally agree. I
So
was bringing that up earlier, Neha.
Yeah,
That-
and when you have standards, I mean, it just makes it so it helps with the collaboration because everybody knows what's going to go on instead of a free for all. Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, no, I was just agreeing, and then I'm grabbing a screenshot of the documenting your decisions here. But yeah, being able to write down on different levels, hey, here's the philosophy we're using. Here is a frame by frame of what the end users are going to be trying to accomplish. Here are the decisions we've made about our approach. Here are how we are breaking down, where and how we're delivering functionality. Having a good dev architect being able to document that is a huge boon to flexible and dynamic, roll on, roll off developers. 10 years of experience versus 3 months of experience you get. So documenting all that stuff and having those standards, for each project or each work stream is huge. And I am that is going to be part of my process from now on. And I am living that gospel from here on out.
And I mean, it just makes it so much easier to collaborate when you know what all the things that you're going to do each time are based on certain criteria. It may not be covering everything, but if you've got a foundation, it makes such a difference. And also knowing what is tech debt and kind of tracking your tech debt if you don't have enough time to clean it up, instead of having like 7 years of back, 7, 10, 15 years of back tech debt and having people go, well, I don't know what's actually real. Or making time to clean up tech debt would be even better. But some people, when you're trying to justify your time, sometimes it's hard. Yeah. Go ahead, Neha. I'm sorry.
No, I just trying to add one thing that in addition to it, after every 6 months or few months, we should revisit that process with the team, not alone, but with the team, take their inputs and refine it time to time.
I love that. And team meetings are great for that, where you go over some of those reminders, but actually having a dedicated time. Yeah, that's even better. If so long as,
Yeah.
how do you find the time to do it, Neha? Where do you get the time to actually set up, every so often we're going to go through it. We're going to make sure that we have standards. How do people find the time to put all that together? Other than it'll save you time in the future. So we may as well do it now. Teach your man to fish, which is usually what I try to push, but that's not always accepted because right now is when they need that time for something else.
Yeah.
So where do you get that time from?
So it doesn't happen very often, but at times people are frustrated with the ongoing process because the customer requirements keeps changing time to time. The processes keeps changing, so we need to be dynamic, right? And we cannot have a same process going on and on for a long time. So at some point, teams, we see that frustration within the team and the disconnect. So when we say that, hey, we need to have this, we need to take time out, and we do take time out because it's not part of a process to take time out. It's out of need.
Agreed. Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, go
So,
ahead.
yeah, Megan. So what I would like to say that you need to have the change process in your place, the center of excellence. That team has to, because it's all the sales, service, or marketing, right? I mean, salespeople are awesome. I mean, regarding using the system, they ask for a particular requirements, you implemented it, they never use it. So the technical debt is going to be high. So you have to have a center of excellence, and every 3 months you have to talk to the salespeople which workflow, I mean, they are never using, which process builder they are never using at all. So that's how you need to, I mean, reduce the technical debt. I mean, and it has to be a team who can constantly chasing all these people. And there's somebody, I mean, the center of excellence, a group, they should do like that. I mean, that's how we can reduce the technical debt. Otherwise, it's very difficult for 7 to 8 and 10 years old org, and you never know what's going to happen. I mean, as you were discussing that lot many workflow, process builder, firing everywhere. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, we cannot control, right? I mean, the runtime, we don't know which is firing when, right? So Apex trigger, flow, workflow, process builder, everything is getting fired. So we have to have a mechanism to make sure we can control the programmatic flow. I mean, that's that Dan Appelman talks about, that how to do that. So you have to have the framework in your place, trigger framework. I mean, how to do that thing. I mean, so those are the area. I mean, enterprise architecture wise, I would say that enterprise patterns with which Neha, I mean, we are discussing in the last with Melissa last meeting, that we need to have implement the enterprise architecture properly. Then only you can be sure that things are not, I mean, getting derailed, right?
And,
People are
and that's
doing the
great for a
correct thing.
project though, but when you're working in an org for a
Yeah,
specific project because you were hired for it, and if you can push a COE all you want, you can help them set one up, and but the fact that they're working on a specific paid project, they don't want to waste that time cleaning up tech debt.
yeah,
I mean,
that's
you'll go blue in the face trying to ask. Yeah. Yeah. And same thing with if they don't have standards, when you're only in for a project, it gets so much harder because you've got everybody else that they hired in the past, different styles in there too. Even
yeah,
if you're following an
absolutely,
enterprise
fully agree.
architecture.
Yeah, fully agree. Fully agree. The thing is that, I mean, the next which Neha talked about, that Salesforce is having the developer best practice. I mean, when you're writing a Apex code, I think it's available on a Salesforce documentation. You have a writing a class. I mean, why are you writing that class? I mean, we talked about Yuan a few minutes back, that we need to have those kind of documents in hand. It's not always possible. I fully agree with people that the old orgs are really very pathetic. I mean, you have lot many technical dates, and the best and the good part is we can reset it very quickly. So Salesforce is a system where the resetting is very easy. You delete everything, your org is fine. So that's how, I mean, you can do, I mean, if it is a very
Who has
difficult
the time to stop business to delete everything and start over?
I mean, so yeah, I mean, you
Who can
have to have
delete
some
everything
kind.
for you if you need it. I have someone who can delete all your Apex for
But
you.
you've got to rebuild stuff then, and that's what people don't have the time for. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I spent 72 hours rebuilding shit.
I'm in
Trust me, it can
org.
happen.
I worked in an org once where they had, 8 years of tech debt because they had never done a cleanup, and the people there now weren't the people there before, and they never had time to go through and document all the stuff from the prior group. And that's so common when you go into some of these orgs and consulting. You'll get at least, half your projects are like that, where nobody ever documented, so they don't even know what their stuff is. And nobody can
Absolutely.
stop business. Yeah. So that collaboration and trying to push for those standards starting now, that's great. But it's just also helping them see the value of going through the process, and I think when you work better as a team together, they're going to see it as more of a win than if you've got somebody that's just kind of dictating everything that needs to be done. To kind of bring it back onto subject too. Yeah.
Yeah, and as far as going into, as a consultant, going into unfamiliar orgs that,
Absolutely.
like you're describing about, I mean, if the client isn't willing or able to I mean, all you can do is keep your side of the street clean, right? I mean, the work that you do, you follow those practices, you build in, I mean, you know what I mean? Like you build into your development time, documentation time. You say, well, this is going to take, maybe 8 hours, because 2 of those hours I'm going to write documentation on on what I wrote.
Having a standard for evaluation too is so important. That way you're all looking at the same thing when you go through. You've got a set of criteria for what to look at. You're not going to be leaving stuff out because you're just going through it. I know that Mr. Jim Ray, Jason, but him and I had to work together on what is it that we need to evaluate every time we go into an org. And I mean, we used that with one of our projects. It changed the whole way that project went because we finally were able to take the time to get that glimpse. And having your developers start with you for requirements and having your developers start with you for that review, so important. Like it can't just be an architect going through it or a BA. It's got to be the team. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you document, like, I don't know, I'm just, if you're in there
correct, Jason.
and you're documenting, like, this took me, I estimate this took me twice as long as it should have because of these reasons in your org. Maybe over time they'll realize that, oh, well, we've got some junk to clean up. This is, in the long run, this is going to save us money and pain.
And I've had projects where you slowly sunset their current org and you go into a new org, but you bring them over slowly into that new org so business never stops. And that has to be one of the most common things I see right now for projects is people are getting a clean org. And more power to them to get rid of all the junk that was there before they started. Because just going back and finding it is going to take so much more time and effort than actually just, slowly moving everyone into something where you know what the requirements are. And start vanilla, don't start with really big complex stuff too.
So Melissa rightly pointed out, and Salesforce is a system that you cannot mess around fully. So if the org is slow, delete everything and starting from the scratch. That's possible. Again, you have a new org. So Salesforce even knows that. That's why the technical dates are becoming more and more.
But
nobody
switching
cares.
over to those orgs really takes a lot out of a company because they have to reevaluate all of their business processes. They have to go through what does it that everybody actually needs for their job. And those projects take longer too, because you're sunsetting so much and you're trying to make sure everything's migrating and you're taking all that extra time, as you mentioned, Jason, to figure out what's doing what, because they didn't know in the beginning. Yeah.
Just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting anyone actually delete all their Apex. I'm just saying
done projects where we slowly
already did it. You told me to do it.
No, I'm not suggesting you do it. I'm saying I actually experienced that. I asked a coworker to delete 45,000 Apex logs, and he dropped the word logs off of that and deleted 500 Apex like code. It can't happen.
Hopefully that was backed up in source control. Oh my
Yeah, you had that in a
Thank
repository,
God.
right?
Thank God we had recently refreshed a sandbox. I was not suggesting anyone ever do that. I was expressing something
Good
that
tip.
had
Don't
actually
delete all
happened.
your code. I'm gonna write that down too.
I talked
Yes,
about 72 hours of trying to
Yeah.
retrieve that. Around December 17th, 2019.
However, if people are in a place where things are so messy that it's going to be, 2-3 times the amount of time to clean it up, I do recommend figuring out, like, do a start from scratch. I mean, you have a number of your requirements from past projects, so you know what's still in place since you've been there. Migrate over to a new org, get rid of all the junk from before you. If
Yeah.
it's that bad, sometimes you just got to cut ties. Yeah.
I think we should stop the recording right now, because whoever's doing the CTA interviews, if they